Dr. Leslee Lazaar from IIT Gandhinagar. So Dr. Lazar's research interests are in understanding multimodal touch perception in humans. He's also interested in understanding the organization of the human tactile system and how it underlies our rich haptic experience. Specifically, he's interested in how higher level processes like language, emotion, body image interact with the low level representations of external stimuli, which are tactile. And also, he's keen on understanding how the tactile system interacts with the visual, auditory, and proprioceptive senses. So, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. And sorry if we kept you waiting. We're really excited for your talk, and up to you now. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Can you all see me?
Yes, we can see you.
You can see me, and you can hear me as well.
Yes.
Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. So shall we start? So how many participants are there? And okay, I see some familiar faces also. People in my class. Okay, so you have instructed them not to put on the videos, is it? Is there a network problem? Stuti?
So there are the co-hosts can switch on their videos and unmute themselves.
Okay. I just wanted to know if you want them to switch on, or that's okay. And I'm not going to look at the chat while I'm talking. Okay. So just the ground rules before we start. So okay, 5:15 I'm starting. Okay, so I'll take about 45 minutes. So what I thought I will do is I'm not going to give a data talk, mostly because I don't have a lot of data. We started our lab this year, and then Corona came and shut down. So we managed to still, do a few experiments, and you must have seen Ishita's presentation at the Monsoon Brain meeting. So what I thought I will do today is give you a broad introduction to the tactile system and talk about perception also, not just, the tactile system, but one of the goals to do this is to help you think about perception in a different way. The moment I say the word perception, I'm sure you thought about, images and color, grandmother cells, apple, those are the examples that come to our mind. And to me also, when I'm talking about perception. But there's something more to the tactile system. And I want to sort of share that excitement and the depth and the breadth of knowledge there. Obviously, in 40 minutes, I'm not going to do that. But I will try to give an overview with certain, inroads into areas that I think are interesting and something that we are starting to look at. So, and at the later part, since you guys asked to see my art, I have like about 4 slides of what I do in my art, and this one is also mine. Okay, so you guys can see the cursor?
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just talk a little bit about my art and show you some of the recent stuff that I've made in the last few months. So hopefully that should be 45 minutes. So let's talk about the tactile system. So why is this not moving? Okay, it's moving. All right. So even when we talk about touch, we generally assume that people are talking about things like this kind of touch. You're touching an external object, like in this. But there's a lot of other kinds of sensory computation that the tactile system does, right? So one is an immersive sort of touch. So you dive into the water, or you dip your arm into the water. The perception of that is not just a linear summation of how much area of the skin is being touched by an object. There's a lot of emergent property in that kind of a touch. So we hardly ever think about that. Then the difference between interactive touch, which is touching another skin, and interactive touch is very, very different for us to feel. It can't just be explained by the fact that the temperature and the compliance of the skin is different. But there's some kind of a higher level sort of involvement in that as well. So philosophers have talked about it a lot. Okay, so you take your left hand and your right hand and you touch it. And after a while, you don't know which is being touched and which touched. And if you start rubbing your hands, you really can't mentally find a border between your left hand and the right hand. Okay, this is something that Merleau-Ponty, one of the greatest phenomenologists, and if you're going to study sensory neuroscience, you have to understand what the phenomenologists have talked about. How they talk about the experience of the world, and that's what we try to base our studies on. Then there is interoception, which is the feeling of your own body. You can hear your heartbeat. You can sort of feel your own body if you have a stomach ache, right? That is interoception. And exteroception is touching external body, which is what a lot of neuroscience studies have focused on. And traditionally, there's been a lot of knowledge and advances in that. And even that touch, when you're touching an external body, it's divided into two divisions. One is an active touch and a passive touch. An active touch is where you actually move your arm while you touch it, and it is something that is very, very natural to us. We hardly ever have a passive touch. Okay? The motor system and the sensory system, when I say sensory system, it's only the tactile sensory system. For me, nothing else exists. So the motor system and the tactile system is very, very intricately linked. Okay? But you'll find a lot of studies in neuroscience which have looked at the passive touch system, mostly because of experimental ease. Even we did some passive touch, even though I keep saying that it's total nonsense. The reason is that it's quite easy to understand the basic principle, the first principles of how these neurons encode touch, and then maybe later we can go into the active touch part. Then there's indirect touch. We keep doing that all the time. Every time we use a pen, right? Every time we use a stick, we so easily incorporate this tool inside our schema, inside our own somatosensory system. At the end, I'll show you a couple of studies that has shown proof that these tools can very easily be integrated. It might seem trivial and it's very intuitive, but whenever there is an intuitive idea, I try to tell you, what if it was not there? What if we could not incorporate these tools, that the somatosensory system could not incorporate these tools as easily as it can? Then we wouldn't have evolved to sit around to play with our computer, mouse, and Zoom. The last touch is metaphorical touch. Like if you look at the circle and the triangle, you would describe it as the circle is touching the triangle, right? You might think this is some kind of philosophical word play, and words obviously have different meaning. But if you notice, we use a lot of metaphors, and these metaphors are very rooted in our sensory motor experience, right? We say it's a rough day, okay? So they actually did do a study where they imaged people's brain when they were using tactile metaphors, like say even a rough day, and asked people to touch a very rough cloth. The same area of the brain that processed the touch for the cloth also processed for these metaphors. So what I'm trying to say is that everything is, interconnected. The tactile system actually encompasses a lot more than just purely touching roughness and studying smoothness and things like that. I'm not saying they're not important. I am going to show some of those studies as well. So another problem, not a problem, another consequence of only thinking visually, right? We tend to use these metaphors and these ideas that we get from a certain sensory realm, and we kind of use it as a template, as a, they call it a cognitive scaffolding happens. And then we tend to use these metaphors and ideas for all kinds of higher cognitive capacities also. Okay? I know it's a little vague. This slide is a little bit of philosophy, but bear with me. So what is the philosophy of visual perception? Okay, we always see things that are outside of us. Okay, and we tend to think that cognition and perceptual mechanisms work like vision. That is, we gain access to the outside world by seeing it, and we get a view of the world. Okay, now what happens is that vision makes us perceive the world very voyeuristically as a spectacle in front of us and misses the background sense of participation that is integral to all perception and cognition. What does that mean? It will make sense when you when I tell you about um, uh, the touch aspect. The touch cannot be perceived without closely associated perception with the body. Okay, one cannot perceive the world without perceiving oneself in the process. So all these quotes come from Merleau-Ponty. Okay, so Merleau-Ponty is a French phenomenologist, philosopher who extensively talked about perception and behavior. Okay, so what he says is touch is partly constitutive of this sense of reality and belonging. Hence, touch has a kind of phenomenological primacy over other senses. Okay. Yes, if you talk to the visual neuroscientists, they'll say 40% of the cortex is involved in vision and all those kind of things. But of course, I agree, vision is important. We are visual animals, but the reason we kind of accept that fact is we keep reiterating that line of thinking. But perhaps we should think about this: where is the sense of reality and belonging? I know neuroscientists don't talk about these issues, but I think we should, especially if you're a tactile neuroscientist. If you're going to study that world, you need to look at these big problems. And it's not the first time somebody says tactile is important. In fact, Aristotle said, very shockingly, in the other senses man is inferior to many animals, but in the sense of touch he far surpasses them all in acuity. That is why he's also the most intelligent of animals. So I mean, obviously Aristotle got more things wrong than right, including this one. Okay, but actually people really puzzle about why did even Aristotle say this, because at those times touch was kind of very base. It was not even thought of something that was a worthy sense. People were talking about vision as the highest thing, and abstract thinking, and that hierarchy was set in those times itself. Anyway, we don't want to go too much into it. So there's one field that directly is affected by this problem of hegemony of visual perception. Okay, and that is architecture. So this is a book, The Eye of the Skin, by a man called Juhani Palasma. He's a Finnish architectural theorist. And so you think of an architect, and if you want to talk about a building, you want to plan a building, you always have plans that are almost, plans are all visual. You really can't say, you really obviously cannot give you the feel of the building, the temperature, the tactility, and things like that. So if you only rely on your visual sense, the buildings become problematic. And that's why he says many buildings are, very nihilistic, which is his word. He says that they're not really something that captures the sense of space. So this is a good quote from Johanni Palasma against the hegemony of vision. It is clear that only the distancing and detaching sense of vision is capable of a nihilistic attitude. It is impossible to think of a nihilistic sense of touch, for instance, because of the unavoidable nearness, intimacy, veracity, and identification that the sense of touch carries. And this is a brilliant cover. So this is the doubting Thomas, right? So Thomas does not believe that the man is Jesus. So he does not trust his vision. He puts his finger and he only believes the tactile sense. So you know this is a good philosophical sort of interdisciplinary grounding, but where does it apply in terms of human behavior? Okay, I know that this group is more interested in that, so I want to take you to some studies which show how touch is developmentally important, not just for development of touch, okay, but for development of pretty much all other functions. So if somebody is blind during childhood, and there have been a lot of studies when people have been blind because of childhood cataract, and when they come back and they live a pretty normal life, and then when the cataract is removed, they regain most of their functions also. But what if you deprive touch? Can you think of a way in which you can deprive touch? And that's what Harry Harlow, some of the most controversial experiments in the world in the monkey field was done by Harry Harlow, where he completely isolated monkeys, okay, in a pit of despair, as he himself called, where it was the moment it was born, it was removed from its mother, and there was no comfort given to this monkey at all. You know, there was no light, there was no sound. There was, I think, food was just dropped in, and but still the monkey could get a sense of touch from this cloth mother. Okay, and the monkey could derive a lot of comfort and its nourishment from this. And then what he did, he switched on to a higher gear of evilness. He replaced his mother with this wire mesh doll, where it's a very deprived sort of touch sensation. And the monkeys would, and then he gave one rag that the monkey would use for comfort. And if the rag was removed, okay, the monkey would even ignore food and it would die. So, so one of the takeaways from his experiments was that touch was developmentally important. Of course, if the monkeys grew up, they were, you know, they had severe disabilities, not just sensory disabilities, but cognitive, emotional disabilities. And a similar sad case was found in the Romanian orphanages after the, the dictatorship and the fall of, the dictatorship in Romania. Um, uh, the um, the other Western countries had access to the Romanian orphanages, where the children were pretty much left on their own, and they were also severely malnourished, and they were really poor in terms of all their cognitive and emotional milestones. So, they started giving food and everything, but it didn't work. And the only thing that worked was touch therapy. So, the more amount of time the children were given skin to skin contact, the better they became. So, it's a very well established neonatal procedure now called kangaroo care, where premature babies are given skin to skin contact. So touch at that time is very, very crucial. It develops almost the entire range of the cognitive, emotional, sensory, motor aspects. Later studies also in rats show that low grooming from the mother would result in high, sorry, it's not corticosteroid, high stress hormones in the pups. And these were lifelong changes for these pups. And in turn, these pups, if they become mother, they also became a low grooming mother. So it was a very damaging sort of effect. But they did find that you could reverse this situation by fostering. If so, I think naturally itself, there would be some high grooming mothers and some pups in the litter who would be ignored. So those can be put in a foster cage, and these, if they were given fostering and good touch, they would start expressing the genes that would sort of negate the stress hormones and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is, from the philosophical underpinnings, we can move on to something more concrete, materialistic for us biologists. So in this line, we can actually, before we start thinking about skin as a perceptual organ, right, we can think of skin as a social organ. And then touch is almost like is a token for communication. Okay. So Robin Dunbar, a pioneering scientist, he noticed that monkeys in their troops, the amount of grooming was much, much more than needed to keep the fur clean, which was the earlier theory. People thought that, okay, you're grooming because you want to keep the fur clean. But then he noticed that that was not the case. The amount of touch was correlated with the size of the troop. Okay? The amount of grooming given and received can also be interpreted as an animal's social status. So I'm sure you know about this because this has become pretty popular. But I want to, the grooming is basically touch, right? And this is not just seen in monkeys. And this particular animal has become quite popular now, is the fruit bat. This is actually not the fruit bat. This is the relative of the fruit bat. This is the one which actually drinks the blood from cattle. So if one bat would go and drink blood and come back, it would, live in a colony with many other individuals. And you can predict how much of blood. So they also have this habit of giving blood from the mouth to another bat. Okay, that's sharing food. So the amount of time they spend touching each other highly correlates to the amount of blood that is being given to another person. That means if you touch and massage the other bat, you're going to get more food. Okay, so this is kind of fundamental. So you can expect these to be, coded in our genes, right? Because uh, mammals, many of the mammals are social animals, and that monkeys and even us, we spend an inordinate time, touch and also in constructing these social hierarchies, maintaining them, breaking them. It's all about that. Okay, and of course, there are so many studies that will tell you that touch is good. If the doctor and the nurse touch the person, their immune system is much better. Waiters, if they touch somebody, they get more tips, co-workers, and all those studies. And you can find plenty of studies like that, including, a study where they looked at the NBA in 2009. I'm not an NBA fan, so I don't know which team. They find that the winning teams touch each other more than the losing teams. Okay, and if you think that this is just some kind of social psychology stuff that neuroscience is not supporting, which is what people used to think actually. So in 2013, so the idea that there is a separate receptor and a separate pathway for this kind of a gentle stroking of the skin and a pleasant touch has been there from the 60s. Okay? Yeah, 60s, 70s. Uh, Not sure, but at least in the 80s, I know that they were there. But there was no clear proof that there was this receptor and there was this pathway. And that came in 2013 with you know, you know all these genetic techniques and tracing techniques. So they identified a particular fiber, which is an axonal fiber that goes from the surface of the skin to the brain, that only activates to massage like stroking of the hairy skin, which is what the monkeys are doing, which is what we are also doing, right? And last month there was a paper, parallel ascending spinal pathways for affective touch and pain. So your discriminative touch, if you want to touch your bottle, if you want to touch the smoothness and roughness, goes through one pathway. All that vibration goes through one pathway, and the pain and affective touch, that is the good massage touch, goes in a completely different pathway. It's not entirely surprising because evolutionarily, that this is a very, very important function. So you need to have a particular pathway in the brain for this kind of affective touch. But for some reason they were kind of neglected, but historical wrongs are being righted in neuroscience as we speak. Okay, so let's now step back or slightly move to the discriminative touch part. Okay? So you see all these materials, right? I know you're seeing them through your eyes, but I want you to imagine that you're touching these. You can clearly close your eyes and find out which is the sweater that has the thick weave and which is smoother, satin, bench, wood, and things like that. So all these happen. So all these, when you encounter on the surface of your skin, let's call it a touch event. So there's some kind of a touch event happening, and from those events, your skin and your mechanoreceptors, which are the cells that are going to decode this touch into electrical activity to send to the brain, somehow has to make sense of the shape, how much pressure, hardness, softness, the vibration, and texture. Texture is a little higher level. You can have you know texture is almost like visual texture. You see a lot of dots and you see less dots. You find a finer texture and a coarser texture. The same thing happens in the tactile system as well. Stickiness, wetness, proprioception. The limb position also can be coded by the way your skin is stretching. Okay, kinesthesia, how the limb is moving. So here also you can get your information from skin stretch, and your Golgi tendon bodies and things like that. Stereognosis is detecting shapes with action. If you think of putting your hands into your pocket and taking out the right key, that is stereogenesis. And then you of course have the temperature, itch, pain, and affective pathway that we talked about. Those are mostly um, um, uh, so not the affective touch. The pain, itch, and temperature are almost like uh, they're chemical senses, because there is a particular chemical that is being released and that has to be sensed by these receptors. Now, what I'm going to go into detail is to kind of give you an idea of what is, what are the mechanoreceptors that are there on the skin, and what is the pathway that takes it up to the brain, and how do we actually feel these different percepts, right? I'm just going to give you an introduction because of lack of time. So, Stuti, can you tell me when it's like 40 minutes?
Sure, definitely, I'll do that.
Okay. So, first things first, we need to just take a brief look at what skin is. Okay. So, we have something called the glabrous skin and the hairy skin. And the hairy skin, everybody knows, no need to explain that, skin with hair. But sometimes in the glabrous skin, people tend to think that your cheeks, not my cheeks, but maybe here, this is a glabrous skin, but they're not. They actually have these very fine, like a down feather sort of hair called the vellum hairs. So the real non-hairy skins are the palm, soles, lips, nipples, and some areas of the genitals. So these are very broad sort of divisions. And if you slice the skin across and you see what's happening here, okay, you have, so I want you to look at this figure. I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to show you that there is a, there are, epidermis has 5 layers of different kinds of cells, okay, and then the dermis has its own stuff going on. So the outer layer has, a lot of bacteria and virus living there, and dead cells also there. The stratum corneum is a layer of dead cells. But you can see the melanocytes here, which give you the skin color, the Langerhans cells, which are the immune cells of the skin. And then here you have something called the Merkel cell. So if you notice, the Merkel cell is sort of connected to something that looks like an axon because it is a neuron. Okay. So, so what happens is any touch that is going to happen here has to be transmitted through these cells, just physically, like you knock on some wood, it transmits, right? Something like that is going to happen here. And then these Merkel cells would pick that up, and we will look at that a little closely, and then it will send information to the brain. So before we even go into these cells, okay, there's one particular aspect of your skin that all of us have, and nobody actually knows why we have fingerprints. Why did we evolve fingerprints is actually an open question. One clue that is seen is that apes and humans, especially when you dip your hand in water, you have this wrinkling sort of phenomenon. For a long time, people thought that it was just material absorbing water and then it's becoming, uh, you know, shrunken. But they noticed that patients with medial nerve damage do not show this wrinkling. Okay, so what that means is that this is a active process, and that there has to be some reason for why this is happening. So of course, people thought that they work like tires. So this is a dry weather tire in Formula One, and this is a wet weather tire. Wet weather tire because these grooves will let the water flow out of the contact surface, and there is going to be more surface area that the tire is going to touch uh, the road surface. So there has been similar studies that show uh, they were trying to model how these ridges were formed, and some say that it could be like how rivers flow from the mountain. But the fact of the matter is that we actually don't know. There were some very simple but fun studies where they would ask people to pick up certain glass marbles of different sizes and see if they do better in wet versus the dry conditions. But there is no conclusive proof as to why we have fingerprints. But the one thing that we know is we have a unique fingerprint for each of us, and then it's used for the crime scene. There's only one animal in the world whose fingerprints would look exactly like humans, And these are actually that animals. And if any of you had guessed it, you're wrong, because it is the, oops, it's the koala, which has a fingerprint that is very similar to the humans. So if you're planning to commit a crime, do not take a koala with you. So, okay, let's now, from the detour of the fingerprints, let's go and look at these, the kind of cells that are going to, you know, uh, transduce your touch event into electrical activity, right? So in the retina, you have your cones and rods that do that. You have the spiral ganglion neurons in the cochlea to do that. And on the skin, you have 4 different kinds of cells. Okay? Merkel's discs, Meissner's corpuscles, uh, Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini's endings, cross and bulbs. Don't worry about the names. Okay, you don't want to remember these names, but just think that if you are taking a finger and you're holding on to a ball that is vibrating, right? And there's a lot of touch events happening there. One is just the surface of the touch, the smoothness, the curvature, and there is some vibration that is happening. And then imagine you spinning the ball, right? You're going to have these micro slips and these events that are happening very transiently. So you need to code for all of these. You cannot have one cell that will detect, 100 hertz vibration to 1 hertz vibration, wetness, smoothness, and things. So there is a division of labor, just like your rods and cones and blue, green, and red. Yeah. So there are two. Uh, there are two of these cells that are pretty close to the surface area, right? The Meissners and Merkels are pretty close to the surface of the skin. So obviously they have higher acuity, right? And you see this Pacinian cell, it actually just looks like an onion. Okay? And that's pretty deep. So this guy will not be able to figure out where exactly on the skin is the pin pricking, right? Because it's not made for that. What it can pick up is like a vibration from a wide range of areas. And it also, so if you touch the bonnet of the car, or even if you touch, the ground, sometimes you can feel the vibration. That is being coded by the Pacinian corpus. And the Meissners and Merkels are mostly for high spatial resolution, edges, curvature, and things like that. So Ruffini's ending are detecting the skin stretch and lateral movement of the skin and things like that. In cross and bulbs, there's not a lot of work done. It's found in conjunctiva of the eye, mucous membranes of the lips, and the genital organs. So um, the so I'm sure you know a little bit about these channels and how they transduce either photons into electrical activity. Here it's very simple. These channels, which are recently discovered, they're called piezo channels. Piezo, here written here. They basically let in your sodium and cause a depolarization just through mechanical stress and shear forces. Okay, so if somebody pressed on the skin here, these cells would have these channels which would start to depolarize. So you would have action potentials, and then those action potentials would be sent up the ladder to the brain. And this is a very nice representation. Suppose you take a person is touching the braille, this is A, B, C, D, and you're only recording from Merkel cell, and each dot here is an action potential. Okay, you recreate the spatial form that activated and gave these action potentials. You'll find something like this. The Merkel cells react only to these dots. So the dots are not there; they immediately switch off. But Meissner corpuscles are a little, blurry. Okay, and Ruffini's they are not coding this at all, and Pacinian's also not coding this at all. So if you were to look for these forms, and if you want to ask for how are people reading Braille, then you'd say, it's mostly Merkel cells that are doing this, and Meissner's corpuscle is not very, not very great at decoding. Definitely not Ruffini's and Pacinian corpuscles. Okay, so once you have these converted into electrical activity, what do you have to do? You have to send it to the brain for processing, right? So there are 4 different pathways. Let's not go into the details, but the dorsal root ganglia has the cell body, which send one axon to be at one of these 5 receptors, and the rest it goes up the spinal cord, goes till the brainstem, and then it switches to the other side, goes to the thalamus, and then it goes to this area in the cortex. We will talk about that soon. So touch from all these areas go in, in a very systematic, orderly fashion. So if you have a cut at this nerve, you would only have deficits in touch events that that are innervated by this branch, okay, of T1 or C2 and things like that. So once it goes all the way up to the brain, the main area that it goes and reaches is area 3B. Okay, so this whole area is called S1. This is the primary somatosensory area. But as you know, there are different kinds of touch, like blunt touch, faint touch, vibration that we talked about. So there is a little parcellization and division of labor among these areas. So they are called area 3B, 3A, 2, and 1. So 3A is more, 3B is the most important part for your fine discriminatory abilities, right? The if you're able to figure out different kind of silk, different kinds of materials, all that is being all that information goes to area 3B. And area 3A is a little bit more grosser. It's for proprioceptive inputs and movements and skin movements and things like that. Area 1 and 2 get information from area 3A and 3B, and they all have their own specialization. Let's not go into the details of that parcellization. But what I want to show you is that so this segregation, right, of which nerve. So these probably will come from the toe. Okay, these will come from the arm. So these will come from the arm. So this whole label line thing is maintained all the way up to the representation of the cortex. So this is, if you remove from the brain and if you take a look at it, the touch sensation from the trunk will be processed in this area here. Okay, and then the neck, head, shoulder, arm, elbow, forearm, and so skin at different parts of the body is projecting to a different part of the brain. It's a very nice way for the brain to keep track of where the touch is coming from, right? We all can perceive where it's coming from. Imagine if it has some kind of a mosaic thing and the brain has to actually make some kind of computation to figure out where the touch is coming from. It's going to be complicated, but this is a very elegant sort of thing. So if you notice, there are some areas that are having larger real estate than other body parts. So you look at the arm, elbow, and forearm, right? They are just very, all compare the space that all 3 of them, the large area, to digit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the hand. So the 5 fingers have a much larger representation than the entire elbow and the arm, right? From arm, elbow, and the forearm. So if you take those numbers and you sort of have an artistic representation, is what you would get here. Okay, so you would have so what this shows, this is called the homunculus, and what this shows is that your touch information from the hand and the lips are processed preferentially. There's a lot more real estate devoted to it, and obviously that means you have more acuity and you're able to do a lot more. Hands, why? Because we do everything with the hands. We're building this whole, everything was done through hands. Lips, because you're putting food into it, you need to figure out whether if you don't have that, you'll be eating stones, and that will tear your intestines and you'll die. So you don't want that. So you want high acuity in the lips as well. So this sort of becomes a map. Okay. So the lab that I worked in for my PhD, we were mostly looking at how these maps would change if there were some inputs that are being cut. Okay, if the hand input is being cut, so all this area becomes vacant. So what will happen, right? We'll look at what will happen later. Okay? So before I take a look at that, I want to show you that different animals have different modifications, adaptations for their own environment. Okay? So this is an animal called the star-nosed mole.
Sir, sorry to
Yep,
interrupt. Just wanted to
yep.
remind you that we're up 20 minutes, 40 minutes.
40 minutes is done.
Yes,
Oh gosh, I was slow. Okay,
no problem.
okay. So I might take like 5-10 minutes more than my usual time. Yeah. So the
Sure.
star-nosed mole has this, weird appendage-like adaptation on its nose, almost like a whisker but fleshy. And if you look at this is its homunculus. Look how enlarged these appendages are because that's what it uses to feed. And this is another rat called the naked mole rat. Okay, and it lives in the desert, so in the burrows of the desert. It has absolutely no eyes, and even in the skin, it doesn't have a lot of mechanoreceptors. But most of its work is done through its canine. So the somatosensory representation, 30% of it is taken over by these two. And of course, the rat whiskers, each of the whisker is represented in a tightly concentrated cell group in the cortex. So that's called the barrel cortex. Okay. So now let's go back to the humans, and then we'll take a look at what happens when you don't have a particular input. Say, suppose your hand is cut. Okay. So this is your normal homunculus. You have feet, trunk, hands, fingers, and face. But once the fingers and hands are not there, this vacant area, what happens is that face will take over, okay, in the brain. So this is what Ramachandran showed in his very famous paper, and of course monkey experiments had showed it even before that, that this person had an amputation in his hand and he was having this phantom limb sensation. He didn't have a hand, but he still felt a phantom limb sensation. The reason is that his representations, his hand representation, which was empty, was taken over by either his shoulder or by his face representation. So now when there is any input coming in from the face to this area, okay, he is perceiving it as a hand because that is a hand area. Okay? So this sort of opened up a lot of studies which not just looked at how this plasticity can be useful, but also questions what is a cortex. I mean, if you can change the input, the nature of the cortex also changes, right? So, uh, so a lot of fundamental questions can be answered, and there are a lot of studies. There's almost a complete field. I teach an entire course called neuroplasticity, which says that your brain actually changes according to whatever training that you give, whether there is a lack of input and things like this. Sometimes you don't. You might even create new representations. For example, you've seen people with who paint with the toes, these double amputees. Sometimes they don't have any other motor effector, so they use their toes to paint. Okay? So their brain, so if you look at a normal brain, your toes are not represented individually. They're just like a blob there as toes, because we really don't use the toe for anything, right, except for removing that latch in the bottom of the door. So you really don't have unique differentiated representation in the somatosensory area. But these foot artists in an fMRI study, they show that they had these each of their toes properly represented, just like our fingers in the hand area. All right. So um, so if we think about the plasticity in the somatosensory area, it's definitely I'm not saying that it is more than the visual area or things like that. I'm saying that once these maps were established, a lot of these pioneering studies were actually started with um, the adult plasticity basically was pioneered by somatosensory researchers, and that it can not just be looking at how processing happens in the somatosensory area, but it also talks about the cortex. For example, people who are blind, okay, they're able to read Braille, which is a purely somatosensory feature, right? So what happens is that they also use their visual area for processing touch information. So I don't know if you guys know how to read this. So this is basically the back of the brain, and this is one half of the brain, and this is the back. And forehead will be here. The back of the head will be here, and this is where your visual area, the primary visual area is. So the somatosensory area would be somewhere here. Okay. So when they were asked to do a pretty complex, braille task or identify tactile animals, the shape of animals on the hand, or even do a tactile orientation, whether it's upside or right, they were actually using their visual cortex to perform these tactile functions. Okay, so in some way it sort of comes full circle that we wanted to really move away from hegemony and fighting about one sense over the other, but really how we process information is that everything is multimodal. There are all these metamodal operators in the brain which would use whichever modality is useful, relevant, less noisy for it to process and solve the problem. Okay. So this is the last slide for the somatosensory part. So this is what I was talking to you about, embodying the tools. Okay. So this is very, very important. So we have one of the best or the best opposable thumb in the world. Okay. The closest opposable thumb, the great apes, just cannot generate the kind of force and pressure that we can do with our thumb. And without that, I don't think we would have the civilization that we have now. And the early cavemen and women, right, they were making these amazing, they call it napping. They hit the stone at an angle and a blade will chip off. Okay? And I'm lucky to be in a place where there's an archaeological center. I've seen these videos. So these archaeologists would, recreate these tools and try and make these, the axe and the blade with the tools that were available for these prehistoric men. So the embodiment of tools is also a very, very vital function that the somatosensory system does. And of course, neuroscientists have been trying to study this for a long time. Descartes has been talking about how a blind man can figure out distance by using two sticks and sort of doing a calculation to figure out what distance it's away from him. This was quoted recently in another paper. So, of course, I want to show you some neuroscience example. So I'm going to show you a neuron that is changing its receptive field and accommodating the tool also into the body schema. Okay. So this was a classic paper by Iwamura, where this is actually this is the receptive field of the neuron. So any touch on the hand, the neuron will activate. Okay. And it also has a field of activity. Anything around the hand could also activate the neuron. Now, what they did was they started training this monkey to take a treat with a 1 meter rake. Now what happened, this neuron would start firing whenever you gave some kind of a light spot and a stimuli around the tool also. What it means is that, I mean, think of it, the neuron is actually changing its receptive field because we just used a tool. And when they did a passive holding of the tool, it didn't matter. So it has to be some kind of a, meaningful concerted action. So the same thing, this is another neuron with receptive field on the shoulder that also expanded to include this area. Sorry, the area that the rake would cover. So what this shows is that um, tools change the touch neurons properties. The tools also get incorporated into the brain representation. So this is a fMRI study. I think fMRI, might be mistaken. I think this is an fMRI study where people were asked to perform a task with a tool and with their arm. And you see, even if you don't know anything about the brain, these color blotches here are very similar to the arm and the tool. Okay. What it means is that the somatosensory system can expand its boundaries and use the tools as sensory extension. Basically, it's the same concept that even spiders use. They have very sensitive touch receptors on their legs. So even if a insect is far away, the reverberation it can sort of absorb and then go and catch the prey. And we obviously use tools. We can detect different textures. We can detect so many things with the stick, right? Because the somatosensory system incorporates the tool and uses it as a sensory extension and is very fine tuned to the changes in the vibration on the stick. So to make sense of what's happening on the other end. So I want to end with this quote by this philosopher of science. So this is another thing that touch is very, this is about touch, but we really don't think about it. So he talks about, I find the cloud-like couch experience so vague that there is no clear distinction between me and where I end and where the couch is. The inner and outer, the subject and the object are here not at all clear and distinct. We have no idea how to think about this in neuroscience. So how much time have I got, Stuti?
So we do have some time. We have a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah. You want to do the questions now, or shall I go ahead and show the art stuff? I just have a few slides.
Sure, sir. You can show the slides
Okay,
to
I'll
us.
just finish off with the. So a lot of you have been asking me about what is the kind of art that I do, and uh, you know, so what I do is something called woodcut printmaking, and that has a strong connection to neuroscience as well. In fact, one of the first proper brain anatomy atlas by Westphal is also was printed using this technique. So these are images from this book printed in, I don't know, sometime around the 1400s, 1500s. And this is one of my images. This is the Descartes' brain, or Descartes' idea of a brain, where he put the, the ventricles were pretty central to him, and the pineal gland. I think this is the pineal gland. He put it pretty central into his diagram. So what this technique is very simple: is you take wood, you draw on it, and you carve using tools like this, and then you roll out ink, you roll it up here, and then you get a board like this. This is one of my students, when I conducted a workshop here. And then you would put the paper and you apply pressure and you get a print like this. Okay. So this is something I did, I think last year. I call this go no go. If you know about these psychology studies, there's a lot of this go no go task where you have to press a button or you don't have to press a button, and so it's sort of a play on that. So there are a lot of these stimuli where you have to differentiate between horizontal and the vertical, noise, and then you make a press a button, and then you have neurons and things like this. These are so. This is the Pacinian receptors. You must have. I hope you remember from the presentation. These are the ones that detect vibration from the skin, and of course, there's a lot of hand in my art because I've been one way or the other involved with the hand, not the political hand, but the scientific hand from my PhD to even now. So this is something that I made during Corona because we were all stuck at home, and this was during when all the construction workers were walking home, and everybody was feeling bad about it, and so I just made this to denote that. It's called T cells will not transport you home. Um, yeah, this is a hydra. I like see animals. Of course, there will be a lot of neurons. And thank you. And now I can address any questions you have about either of these or anything. So also, I just want to tell you that we do have a master's program in cognitive science, and I know that many of you are undergrad students, and I would urge you to look at our program and join us, contact us if you're interested. We do have a PhD and a master's program. All right, I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for that intriguing presentation and your amazing artwork. It's very famous. So we will just go ahead with the questions now. We have a couple of them. So the first
Am I
question we
supposed to
have is,
read? Sorry. I was going to ask if
so
I should read the text, sorry, the chat, or you will ask the questions.
So I will relay the questions to you
All
and
right.
you can
Okay.
probably answer them. All right. So the first question that we have is from Akshay, and he asks if you have watched some oddly satisfying videos. He wonders if there's a relation. Sorry. So he wonders if there is a relation between visual and some sort of pseudo tactile perception. It sure does feel like he's actually performing the activity to him.
Okay. So there is a lot of cross-modal interactions between vision and touch, and of course with touch and sound, and everything is, they're all interconnected. Okay, so you remember this guy's idea. So this eyes of the skin, right? Essentially, he's talking about that when you look at some kind of a tactile stimuli, even visually, right, you can have some kind of a weird feeling. It's not very well fleshed out, but you do get some kind of a feeling. So that is one. The second part is that there are a lot of experiments that show that, suppose I ask you to detect different textures, okay, but I ask you to look at um, visual textures. Okay. So what I'm processing with my vision can actually go and interfere with my tactile perception also, and it works both ways. Well, it works a lot, vision affecting tactile. There's only very few studies that show that tactile is affecting the visual. But to answer this question, there is interconnection between the two.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next question, Shreyas asks, he was
Bitu.
wondering about the
Thanks, Bitu. Sorry.
he was, so Shreyas asks that he was wondering about the possible contradiction which could arise between metaphoric touch and actual sensory touch. For example, having a rough day and touching a satin cloth. So, could touching a satin cloth make one feel better when having a rough day?
Okay, I think there are two things there. One is just a purely affective touch. Whatever you find that is comforting and all that can make your day better. That you don't have to ask the question. But how much of the metaphorical language is affecting your perception? Okay, that's a little controversial. There were a lot of these studies which have been debunked now. They would do experiments like they would ask you to hold a warm cup of coffee, and then they would ask you to rate applicants, and then they would ask you to hold a cold cup of coffee and then ask you to rate applicants. And then they showed that people who are holding the warm cup of coffee had more warmer sort of adjectives to describe the applicants, and more warmer and things like that. But those studies have now all been called into question. So I would just stop with saying our metaphors are deeply connected to our sensory motor experiences. But how much of them are in turn connected to higher level behavior where there are so many other sort of factors, I would hold my horses on that. Okay. I hope I answered the question.
Definitely. So Joshua asks, sometimes when you remember an event in which someone who has an emotional significance hugging you, you could feel the hug to some level. So his question is, just like visual and auditory, sorry, yeah, so just like visual and auditory memory, is there tactile memory as well?
Well, I think you answered the question, right? I mean, if you can remember the touch, then you do have tactile memory. But I should also warn you that you're actually now going into the territory of mental imagery, right? And you are trying to relive something that happens in the past, so you're bringing something up to your working memory. And what really is that imagery, and how is it stored, whether it's a modal or it is tied to the same sensory modality that it was tied in, it's a little controversial. So I would say I don't know.
All right, thank you. And also Bhavika had a question which I think she already got the answer for. So she was asking if we acquire more sensitivity to touch, for example, in our palm as compared to other parts of the hand, like forearm or upper arm, or
Hmm.
are we born with this higher sensitivity?
Sorry, there is some construction. Can you repeat that question again?
So Bhavika asked if we acquire more sensitivity to touch, for example, in our palm as compared to other parts of the hand, like forearm or upper arm, or are we
Yeah.
born with higher sensitivity? I think you already answered this.
I did, yeah. So you do have higher acuity in the fingertips. So if you look at the homunculus, right, all the enlarged parts will have higher density of mechanoreceptors, higher innervation density, and all kinds of acuity is higher in there. Okay. So learning can happen everywhere, but it's not going to overtake your, you know, places that you already had higher density.
All right, thank you so much,
Okay.
Dr. Leslie. That was all from the questions from the audience, and we have our next speaker already who has joined us, Dr. Arjun. So thank you so much again, Dr. Leslie.
Thank
It
you
was
for
really
calling me, and congrats for doing this.
thank
It
you
was a
so much.
really nice conference, and sadly I couldn't come to a lot of the talks that I wanted to because of some personal stuff, but really happy that this is happening.